It would be interesting to look for the Carpathia and the California, since everybody's made such a big thing about the Titanic and the Britannic. And so in the research, the California was also torpedoed in World War I, as was the Carpathia. But she's in about 13,000 feet deep in the Mediterranean, plus nobody has a very good position, so that's kind of nebulous. But the Carpathia, on the other hand, being torpedoed 6 years after her great Titanic run, had a fairly good location, let's say with 20 square miles. So that was in the ballpark that could be found.
So you've been hunting?
Yeah, we went out in December. And first one we found, we thought we had it, but it turned out to be the Isis. As soon as we got an ROV down on it, we found 4 blades instead of 3 blades on the propellers. And even though it was roughly the same size. And then we brought up a dish that said Hamburg American line. So then we started researching, and very little is written. We just found a couple of small news accounts on the Isis, which went down in a heavy storm with 39 on board. I think only the cabin boy was saved. So there is an interesting story in itself, but it wasn't what we were after. And just when we get another target, then the weather beat us out. So we're going back next month and try again.
That's great. You know what I like so much about these things is there's so much fun invested, as well as dollars, I guess, in the searches. But the stories that come out of them, even if it's the one that gets away, the stories about the people are so fascinating, and the history. And it's there, but it's as submerged as the wreck sometimes. And it's only when you start digging into it that these stories come up.
That's true. The research is the fun. And every wreck, there's a story, if you can, as you can say, dig it out because of the people involved.
Yeah. Well, at the end of the day, I think why I dive on shipwrecks, why I look at shipwrecks, why I've been so passionate about it, is because I'm fascinated by people. And the threads that you see through time with people acting different ways, the oft-cited cowardice or the heroism is a piece of it. But just the silly little things that people will do and the things that remind you of their humanity. On the Titanic, Molly Brown taking her good luck Egyptian ushabti and carrying it with her. Or the people that will go back and die because they have to save some priceless heirloom that is meaningless to anyone else. Right. And even those people who we don't know exactly who they are, they're faceless, they're nameless oftentimes, but they're not voiceless to me as the archaeologist, because you see with what they've left behind or what they've chosen to take with them in their baggage a bit of who they are. And where that came true for me was when we were doing an exhibit here on the Titanic, and a fellow had collected the contents of a trunk that had been bobbing on the surface of the Atlantic after the sinking, and it belonged to one of the steerage passengers. And the most evocative thing of all in that trunk for me was this woman's blouse, dated to the 1870s, repaired and modified several times. It had been passed on. It had been at the height of fashion 30 to 40 years ago when the Titanic had gone down, and yet it had been saved and held together and changed for different wears. It had probably gone through 3 different generations of hands until the final generation to own it went down on the Titanic. And here it is, and I don't know who these people are, but I have some sense of them, and that's why I do what I do.
I know you find and touch something like that, and you just wonder, who was this person? What kind of a life did they lead? How was it? Was it a good life? Did they have problems? It's just so fascinating. I know in the Titanic, people would always ask, why the Titanic? Well, it took 2 hours and 40 minutes to sink, so you had these vignettes and the drama, the band playing, and Molly Brown, the Strausses, the Astors, and so on, where the Lusitania went down in 18 minutes, even though Vanderbilt and Frohman and many others were on board, but it's just the story wasn't there because it happened so quickly.
I think that's got power for people today, because these days when we have these mass disasters, when a plane goes down, it's a matter of a few minutes or even seconds. the Titanic taking so long allowed a great drama to play out.
Right.
And that drama, I think, is what's captured people.
Mm-hmm. It was the end of an era because the celebrities of those days were the wealthy instead of, like today, the entertainers and the sports figures. And when people saw that the wealthy, they just put on this huge pedestal, died just like the passengers in third class and steerage, all of a sudden everyone looked at life a little bit differently.
Oh, I think so. I think as well, everybody that thought that the spirit of the age and the modern technology, being foolproof, suddenly being shown as nothing more than a sham. That also changed perceptions too, and that's why I think people continually go back to it. I think that whole idea of finding it is pretty fascinating too, because what strikes me is that, and the one reason why people like us to do what we do, is these stories and these events are distant. They're through a veil. But when you actually find them and you can see it and touch it, it becomes real.
Oh, yes.
And, well, I know for me in particular, talking to folks, hearing their memories and their reminiscences, or reading about it in a book, and then actually going down there and touching it, it's magic.
It really is. It's just like swimming through a wreck is almost like walking through a haunted house. You wonder just who the ghosts were.
We're going to cut in there, Jim. Give that's this perfect point now.
But
Well, the great story on the Carpathia is the fact that it almost didn't happen because the radio operator of the California had gone to bed and missed the first SOS or CDQ, but the Cottrell, the operator on the Carpathia, had kept his headset on, and he was going to bed, but he was sitting there untying his shoes. So another, like 10 seconds, he'd have pulled it off, and they would have missed it. But he just caught it, ran up, beat on the door, rushed into Captain Rostrom's, cabin, and Rostrom was all ticked off. How dare they come in here and do this, like a radio operator? And then he said the Titanic, is sinking, and he said, "Are you sure?" And Rostrom didn't fool around. He got turned out. All the stewardess got blankets, the galley, the engine room, ready with the boats and everything. And the engine room turned out, they had 3 shifts on the stokers. And these guys turned out in their long johns, all 3 shifts, shoveling like crazy. And the old Carpathia was never, designed to go more than 14 knots. But, 15 and a half, 16, got up to 17 knots. Nobody knew it could pound so hard. And, of course, got there. And I think it's safe to say that a lot of the Titanic survivors could have succumbed to the cold if the Carpathia had been like 2 hours later or something like that. So it was really an interesting story how it arrived there.
Well, it's amazing for me reading some of the accounts of these survivors, and they're there in these tiny boats bobbing in the Atlantic, and they've just seen their entire world collapse. This big floating palace has gone to the bottom. People have died, and now they're alone and isolated, and they're beginning to contemplate their own death. And suddenly, here she is, heaving into view, and they get their life back. It's an amazing moment. And I guess that's why Carpathia has such an appeal. And Rostron is deservedly a hero, as well as his entire crew. What amazes me is that so much emphasis is placed on Titanic, but not on Carpathia. And I think part of that is because Titanic now has been found, and people can go down and relive the scene of the tragedy. So now, to try to rectify things, you're hunting for Carpathia.
Right, to try and kind of, not close, but, complete the story a little more. It'd be nice if we could find the California, too. But finding the Carpathia will just add another chapter to the Titanic. And speaking of the lifeboats, it's interesting that the women didn't do very well. They They wouldn't take on, they were the ones that screamed and yelled about taking on other survivors or going back. Just overall, the women did not conduct themselves as one would have hoped. I remember when they started researching all that, other than Molly Brown. And she, by the way, of course, had medals minted and made for the entire crew of the Carpathia. I tried to find one years ago and just couldn't, and now I see that when one does come up for sale, it goes for about $25,000-$30,000.
Oh, it's incredible. And yet, the women of the Titanic would turn out and commission a monument in Washington, D.C. to the gallant men of the Titanic who gave their lives to survive. And those stories that flow around it, just like the currents that wash around the wreck, I guess, are part of the appeal. So you're out hunting for Carpathia.
Right.
You've got a pretty good idea of where she is. And it's a 20-mile square area. What are you using to look for?
This forward-seeking radar, which, of course, goes out much further than the average radar because... and all the times I've used even the best machines, you throw it out 1,000 yards and you get a battleship and it's a little tiny speck, know. And
Clive, I missed you. Okay, there we go.
So now you're going to go out and you're going to hunt for Carpathia. What are you looking? So you're going to go out and hunt for Carpathia. What are you using?
Well, we're using the forward-seeking sonar, which throws out a huge beam for more miles and particularly much greater distance than the regular side-scan sonar. Because, as you know, when you throw that out 1,000 yards on each side, you can find a battleship, and it's just a tiny speck. It's just no detail at all. And it's a lot of people don't realize that side-scan sonar is like looking at a photograph that's been Xeroxed about 3 times.
Yeah.
So that's the primary, and then when we do find the wreck, then we'll send down the robotic vehicle, with the cameras to take video of it, and hopefully can identify it, and just go from there.
It really will sort of close the book.
I hope so. There's really nothing to salvage on the Carpathia of value, other than the fact there's supposed to be a display case with all these trophies that were awarded the Carpathia for rescuing the Titanic survivors, and that's supposed to be still on board.
That'd be a wonderful thing to find, to recover, and put into a museum.
Oh, yes, indeed.
That's, I guess, one reason why I like working in museums now, is so many times as an archaeologist I've gone down to the bottom, I've taken a look at a ship, and I come back and I tell people about it. And sure, I've got some pictures and drawings, but the real thing
not the same.
It's not the same. You're absolutely right. And so to be able to, with all the proper science, go down, bring something up, preserve it, because a lot of people don't realize just how much effort and cost it takes to preserve something that comes out of the sea. You've paid for it. But then to put it on display so people can see it. Here in this museum, we've got pieces of some famous shipwrecks, famous in this part of the world. And for people, when they look at that stuff, when they see it, they're transported because it's not some obscure, distant event anymore. Here's the real thing.